chatting with you. As Maria said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some work that I've been doing on disaster risk management for systems analysis. And what I really want to do is I've kind of been giving some thought on how we can be applying systems approaches to disaster management research, specifically research directed at policy and policy improvement. So I wanted to provide a few examples of some of the work that I've done, give a bit of a background to to who I am and to where I think the field is at the moment, both in research and in practice. But then really open things up for what I'm hoping is a robust discussion. I have a few discussion prompts at the end that we could go into, but if you have any questions or comments or want to interject, please do so. And I'm not going to be monitoring the chat or looking at people with raised hands. So please just butt on in, and I'll really appreciate it. So I'm hoping we can have a nice little discussion here. About me, Maria mentioned I'm at Pardee Rand, professor at Pardee Rand, which is our graduate school. I'm also a relatively undisciplined social scientist focusing on disasters and disaster management at Rand, which is a nonprofit think tank, that does research on a bunch of different areas. I don't really have a hazard specialty, or and I work across the hazard cycle. I've done work in the U.S., but have quite a bit of global work. And some of my work is pretty basic, where other work is quite applied. I guess if I had to pick a piece of glue that kind of ties this all together, is I like to focus on affected populations, households, and loaded term of community, and try and understand what are the risks, what are the vulnerabilities, and how can you put community perspectives forward in policy research. So co-production, community-driven approaches, stuff like that. As a policy researcher, I often put the bottom line up front. So this is where I'm currently thinking about systems approaches for disaster management. I found a lot of utility in systems approaches, and a lot of relevance across an array of different disaster-related topics. This can be analyzing stakeholders, risk assessment, risk management. I think there is some utility when it comes to policy research, but it's quite difficult to communicate findings from systems approaches and something that's coherent or comprehensive, legible for non-experts. And I also kind of worry that there's this potential for oversimplification, and then failure to kind of diagnose certain problems. I have this question of are our systems really just too complex to apply these approaches to, and are we presenting this sort of false version of certainty? And I think that there's space for further work on particularly systems approaches for risk assessment, and then systems approaches when it comes to actual policy analysis. And I'll get into all this in more detail, but that's the bottom line takeaway for me. Here's what we're dealing with. Here's here's the policy challenge. It's a combination of complex risks, a fragmented disaster management system, and then I guess knowledge problems. So complex risks, right? Vulnerability. It's place-based. It's context-specific. It's multifaceted. Many different processes come together to construct vulnerability. This can be political, economic, social, environmental, and it varies location to location. Hazards are also emergent, and risks can cascade. The realization of one risk can exacerbate a vulnerability or trigger another hazard, and create another risk. So these risks can kind of propagate in unexpected and difficult to analyze sorts of ways. The system that we have for managing disasters, I think, over the past, I don't know, couple of decades, we've really made a lot of progress when it comes to setting up structures to address risk, to minimize risk, to improve preparedness and response. I think that is a bit of a win when it comes to this field. Of course, more work needs to be done, but we're making progress. At the same time, things are pretty fragmented. We consider disaster management this sort of like multi-stakeholder endeavor, that operates across different sectors, and it's difficult to kind of govern, control, and move this system forward in a coherent manner. Those two issues then feed into it's the sense-making problem of we have this incredible complexity when it comes to the riskscape and when it comes to the risk management scape. How do you actually go about making sense of all of this and understanding all of this, and seeing where sort of like the key areas are that you need to improve or reform, and how do these components kind of relate to each other? So that's sort of broadly speaking where the challenge lies. These complex risks, fragmented systems, and then problems in understanding. Systems analysis and systems approaches, it could be a way for improving disaster research and practice and addressing some of these challenges. I really don't want to get into these sort of like definitional discussions on what is or is not, a systems approach. Different fields think about systems in different sorts of ways, and have different like working definitions of what constitutes a systems approach. But in general, there's this perspective. It has a perspective of, let's think holistically. Let's try and encapsulate and look at the entire system. Let's also focus on those individual pieces and see how they fit together, see how they stack up, and see how they combine to shape that overall system. And then, a third part that when I'm trying to think about, is this a systems approach or not? There's often this propensity or this focus on modeling and visualizing the system. There's a lot of complexity in these systems and a lot of components, and it's useful to get that visualization or bird's eye view of how all of these things fit together. Systems analysis, it has a very rich history in policy analysis. It was kind of started back in World War II, to understand things like strategic bombing campaigns. And like I said, I'm at RAND. We do a lot of defense work, and RAND really worked to establish some of the key tenets and approaches to systems analysis back in the day. The picture on the right is something I pulled off of the RAND intranet site, and it's 1960 document on systems approaches in country studies. So it's been used for quite a while in other fields. My feeling, and kind of what I'm seeing in disaster management and disaster studies, I don't know if we want to label it a systems turn. We might. There is a body of research that is starting to form on systems approaches. I think a lot of it is kind of implicit to the field of disaster studies, and it centers on systems and risk creation. And then, in practice, in the implementation of disaster risk reduction projects or the formulation of disaster-related policy, practitioners are increasingly turning to systems approaches and trying to think systematically when it comes to design and execution of policy. So I think this is a more of a recent trend, but it's interesting to start to see it take shape. I want to give just a couple of examples of systems approaches in other fields to help us start to think more about its application in disaster. The forest is an example of a system. It's an ecosystem. You've got these sets of actors or stakeholders or components that interact in different sorts of ways. So there's trees, the forest floor, understory plants, and they shape each other. Trees, the leaves fall to the forest floor, which nutrients are then leached into the soil, and then roots take up the water of the trees. It's a system. It's an example of an ecosystem. You also have technological systems out there. The U.S. electric grid is an example of a technological system. It's this like super vast machine. It's this network of electric generation, transmission, and then distribution to different sorts of customers. So it's kind of a quintessential technological system. Lots of different parts, owned and operated by many different utilities across the United States, but functioning together as, actually a set of three different wholes. Often though, systems, they're not just natural, they're not just technological, they're not just social. They're socio-technical. They're blends of social processes, of technological processes, and of natural processes. The carbon dioxide in our atmosphere is an example of what could be classified as a socio-technical system, in that it's the product and the outcome of human decisions about carbon emissions, natural environment, the atmosphere, all of these different subsystems, I guess, operating together as a macro system. So those are, some examples of different systems that we've worked to map and to understand. In disaster research, I really see a lot of systems thinking or systems considerations coming into our understanding of risk and, how risks are created. So I think most of you probably have read Charles Perrow's Normal Accidents. He wrote it in the 80s after the 3 Mile Island disaster. But Perrow, he coined the term systems accident. And he sort of analyzed all of these different systems by their complexity. A relatively simple system, things are pretty linear, to complex. There's a lot of interdependencies, and the sums are kind of different than the parts. He also looked at coupling, which coupling, if coupling is kind of loose, there's a lot of lag time and a lot of distance between thing A occurring and then thing B occurring. If there's tight coupling, thing A triggers rapid thing B, which triggers rapid thing C. He then looked at these different systems and plotted them from their interactive complexity to their coupling, and identified systems that were tightly coupled and then very complex as having the potential for these system accidents, where if something goes wrong, which you can't predict because there's complexity there, it's going to cause this chain reaction that you can't stop because things are super tightly coupled. So Perrow, he kind of viewed systems as shaping the creation of a certain type of risk. In this case, a normal accident or a system accident. He used the term normal accident quite frequently, but he also argued in his book that these normal accidents don't actually occur with great frequency. They only really happen in these super specific systems. So a lot of the accidents and a lot of the disasters that we see, they are not systems accidents. They are not these normal accidents. They're occurring because of neglect, because of carelessness, because of all of these other factors. I would say that those issues of neglect and carelessness and those other factors, the sort of classic disasters that we often end up focusing on, they have also been framed from this systems perspective. So pressure and release model from At Risk, Ben's book, it kind of has this systems orientation where there's these root causes, there's these global systems at play, that create limited access to power, structure, and resources, and they're shaped by these political systems, these economic systems, and then they then manifest in dynamic pressures, unsafe conditions, and ultimately disasters. It's this systems view that there's these global macro forces that are shaping risk and disaster. This is in many ways, I think, a continuation of some of Ben's earlier work in the first issue of Disasters, where he uses the term global systems and local disasters, untapped power, people's science. So it's kind of it's kind of foundational in how we're thinking about risk and how we're thinking about the construction of vulnerability. So that's where I'm kind of seeing some of the systems thinking in disaster research. It's this underlying consideration that particularly when you're thinking from a vulnerability perspective, or maybe a resilience perspective, it pops up. That's where you're attributing blame, and that's where you're attributing some of the responsibility. More recently, I would say in the past 5, 10 years, maybe 15 years, the practitioner and policymaking community has been exploring systems and systems approaches for risk and disaster management. So trying to take some of these systems techniques and understand, okay, how should we design our programs? How should we structure interventions? How can we begin to think systematically, and execute interventions that reduce risk and improve resilience. So I've put a few examples up there that I'm familiar with. USAID, they have a systems initiative. They're trying to put forward systems thinking. They have this, for instance, paper on systems thinking in conflict and fragile and conflict affected areas. In the US, the Federal Agency for Disaster Management, FEMA, it has its whole community approach, which conceptualized disaster management as the joint outcome of the work of many different stakeholders, individuals and communities, nonprofits, state, local, and tribal partners, private sector, and then the feds playing a pretty supporting role. Then you have organizations like IRC and Goal Global, and these are NGOs that operate in poorer countries, and they've been trying to put forward their ideas on systems approaches and really develop tools that practitioners can use for figuring out where they should be focusing their risk reduction efforts. Some of the other trends that the sector has been working towards also have this sort of systems orientation. LRRD back in the early 2000s, late 90s, linking relief, rehabilitation, and development. That was a way of trying to break down silos and understand that these sectors should be combined to kind of reduce risk, or should work together to reduce risk. The triple nexus of development, peace, and humanitarian action. That's That's also sort of a systems thinking of like, let's integrate our programs and join up things to, to try and support the lives of the extreme poor. And then, the resilience agenda, which has kind of exploded since like 2010, 2011. There's a lot of folks that kind of argue that it's a direct manifestation of, complex systems thinking, in that these risks are emergent and uncontrollable, and all we can really do is be resilient to crisis, for better or for worse. So we're seeing it. We're seeing it in practice quite a bit. And like I said, I'm also sort of trying to play with some of this stuff. This is a big, somewhat messy table. The aim here isn't to read all of it. I just want to give you some feel for a few different projects that I've been working on that have this systems lens. So I put a few up there, and the key sort of takeaway is that systems approaches, they can be used for different things, from policy analysis to risk assessment to policy implementation. Doesn't really matter where you use them. You can use them globally. They can be hazard agnostic or hazard specific. You can employ or utilize different sorts of techniques. And then, some of them can focus very much on stakeholders and the network of relationships between stakeholders. These are pretty useful for thinking about interventions and thinking about who's doing what. Whereas others can be a little bit more conceptual, or focused on non-stakeholders. So these system orientations. And then the last one, I think, which is important for research, is they can use different data sets in different sorts of ways. I want to focus on giving a couple examples just on social network analysis, just for ease of thinking. Covering different analysis techniques can take quite a bit of brain power, and SNA, it's simple enough. So what is it? Social network analysis, it is a form of systems approach. It's the study of patterns of relationships. Those are edges between stakeholders. Those are nodes in a system or network. So a node can kind of be anything. It's often used for different people or different organizations. So how does one organization work with another or not work with another? It can also be used for things like, different parts of an infrastructure. Talked about the electric grid. So, the relationship between a generation facility, something that's making the electricity, and then a transmission and distribution. So, the node is kind of agnostic. It can be a person, organization, or a thing. And then the edge just describes that sort of relationship. With that, you can then use it to analyze a system and the stakeholders within it. Identify who's powerful, who's peripheral. Figure out where to kind of bridge things. The figure on the right is the result of a social network analysis in action. That's the first little example that I wanted to share with you. This is actually from my doctoral work, and I went to a bunch of different countries looking at disaster management, the disaster management systems, and how community-driven disaster management approaches fit in with these systems. I got kind of curious as to like who's the stakeholder makeup in these systems. We often say disaster risk reduction is this multi-stakeholder responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility, but you often see the same sort of people in the room. So I took a lot of old policy documents, IOGA framework for action, midterm reviews, NGO reports, combined that with interviews, to get this huge list of stakeholders that were involved in DRR in different countries. turned that into social network analysis. And then I found that, despite the rhetoric of DRR being disaster risk reduction being everyone's business, it really is dominated by the government and, these international NGOs. And, to me, it kind of suggests that this multi-stakeholder term is a bit of a buzzword and, it's kind of overstated. There were some challenges here, this was pre-existing data sets. These were secondary data from documents primarily with some interviews, and it was hard to kind of extract these relations. And the other thing is, these documents and these interviews aren't necessarily the lived experience on the ground in reality. The reality is it's people who are doing the work to reduce vulnerability and address risk. Cognizant of time, so I'm going to go over a couple of these a little bit more quickly. Here's another example. This was, again, old doctoral work. I was in Freetown, the capital of Sierra Leone, and Freetown is this mountainous city, and in the valleys there's these informal settlements, and they flood regularly, and the flooding creates waterborne disease. It disrupts livelihoods. It affects access to schools and education. I was interested in trying to understand and then represent how the causes of flooding and then the consequences of flooding interrelated. So often when you try and analyze something like a flood, you might do something like, I don't know, a fault tree analysis, where you list all of the causes on one side, the consequences on another side, and then you identify the primary driver in the middle that then needs to change. Here, you see these risks and flooding to create this sort of cascade of consequences that then feed into some of the causes. So these consequences and these causes, they're interrelated, and they operate in kind of a network, which when I interviewed a bunch of folks that were living with flood, asked them, okay, so why is your situation like this? Why are you exposed, and what happens when you're affected by floods? The results of those interviews ultimately pointed to poverty as being a main driver, which is kind of unsurprising. It's what a lot of the disaster research kind of identifies as, hey, this is both an ultimate cause and then a consequence of living with risk. So that's an example of kind of trying to use systems approaches for in this case assessing risk and understanding the relationships between causes and consequences, and how hazards and disasters can cascade and shape vulnerability for different populations. Some other work that I've done after Hurricane Maria hit the island of Puerto Rico, we at RAND, we did a huge study to support the government of Puerto Rico and develop their recovery plans. In it, we identified who should do what for each of these sort of recovery options. That was pretty simple to turn into this big network map of recovery stakeholders. And in it, it was what became clear from this analysis, which wasn't clear in this. It was like a 200-page plan, was the municipal government was, really central in coordinating recovery, and, should be a key stakeholder in driving the recovery forward. So it emerged, across all of these different recovery options as a primary stakeholder in facilitating recovery. Another example, this is in a book chapter that's coming out pretty soon, but CDC asked us to look at online dis and misinformation related to health disasters. We looked at the 2020 Oregon wildfires and the information that was spreading online on Twitter. And these fires, I don't know if y'all remember, but there were rumors that Antifa was going out and intentionally starting these fires to get revenge on on rural America. There's it was right after the George Floyd killings, and there was a lot of tension, and it resulted in these community members setting up armed checkpoints at their community to try and defend themselves from Antifa. Completely unfounded, completely unfactual, absolutely insane. We pulled a bunch of tweets and created this network of information and misinformation, and we found that despite these claims of Twitter and other social networking sites being sort of the people's street corner and that everyone can have a say, the ones that were propagating this misinformation, it was really the elites. So Sean Hannity at Fox News popped up as one of a main focal person for propagating this dis and misinformation. One challenge here is that extracting all of these tweets, pretty technical process. I don't think we're even allowed access to these Twitter data sets anymore, and communicating this stuff to public health officials, and then figuring out how to operationalize it for combating dis and misinformation is tricky, So if it's Sean Hannity that's the one that's driving a lot of this discourse online, what's a local public health official really to do? Their voice is fairly limited in changing Sean Hannity's behavior. If he's sort of intentionally spreading information that gets him clicks, gets him views. Another couple, and then I'll wrap up. Last one, I worked with this nonprofit focused on the role of faith in religion and development to try and understand how they should be influencing the global compact on refugees. That's a it's a global policy related to refugees. What we did is we sent out a survey this nonprofits to their members and to the people that they worked with, asking them to identify who they were trying to engage with and who was engaging with them when it came to shaping the GCR, this global compact. We saw that there was a lot of organizational collaboration going on, and that as a result, we kind of thought, yeah, this is an example of policy development as a networked process or a networked governance process. And there are some key stakeholders that we thought, yeah, those are probably central. We knew that ahead of time. And then others that kind of popped out that we didn't realize. Thought it was a pretty useful project, and the partners found it helpful. At the same time, like, it was a small survey, and it's not the full network, and it also isn't kind of the behind the scenes of policy development, some of those backroom discussions. That's not necessarily captured in this type of work. And last one, I just wanted to plug this. This is a report that is coming out in, I don't know, a couple of weeks, where a collaborator, Jessica Jensen, and I set out to map the emergency management knowledge production landscape. This was a crazy project. We ended up pulling over 140,000 emergency management related articles from Web of Science, and doing a bunch of analysis to try and understand the structure of how these articles were being produced. So who was working with whom, what institutions were collaborating, who's paying for all of this, which countries are, where are sort of the country hubs when it comes to EM work. This was a big project, and POP came up with some fairly interesting results on the structure of emergency management, which I I don't want to give away. I'll wait for the report to get released. Some of the challenges that we found, though, is we had to make a lot of judgment calls when it came to what's in and what's out when it comes to emergency management. So what search terms are we using? And when we read an abstract, how do we give it the thumbs up or the thumbs down? There are also some problems with this Web of Science data set. It claims to be comprehensive, but there's really nothing there, like pre-1990s, and other documents are missing. And we did this for FEMA, and the results we had to sort of present in very plain language, and not bombard them with these like network maps and statistical results. And I found it kind of a challenging communication issue. But that said, I think it's a really neat study, and I'm excited for it to come out, and it should give a decent grounding of, this is the current state of emergency management research, those caveats aside. That's kind of been the whirlwind tour of some of the approaches and some of the projects that I've been doing on systems analysis. I gave you this in the beginning, but final thoughts. I think that this is a pretty useful tool. There's some potential, or useful approach. I think there's some potential here for policy analysis. I have this question of, like, the systems that we deal with, they're incredibly complex and multifaceted, and you're always missing something. And I worry that representing these systems in this sort of way creates this false confidence, and might encourage decisions based on a certainty that isn't actually there. And I think we need to do a little bit more work on trying to make this stuff relevant for policy, and also specifically trying to use it to assess risk. I think that's something that we're still kind of working on, and there's some potential there. So those are my last thoughts. I have a series of discussion prompts, but I'm also very happy to just open things up. And if y'all have any questions, feel free to ask them. But I really just welcome some discussion and some thoughtfulness on this stuff. Thanks so much for your time.